Sure. Thomas, thank you so much for joining us today. And if you could start by introducing yourself, tell us a little bit about your background and your current position and research interests.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's best to start. I have a really kind of messy background, so maybe that's where to start, right? So, one thing started to take, business school in Norway, then transfer that over to some studies in philosophy before I did a master's in psychology and neuropsychology. So I've been working some years and have an authorization as a neuropsychologist here in Denmark. And then I did a PhD in neurobiology and neuroimaging. The primary focus was on structural and functional MRI, but I also did studies on positron emission tomography, some, of course, also EEG, and dabbled into some of the other methodologies as well. While I was finalizing my PhD, I during the PhD period, I was also very much interested in how we can understand, how we can transfer this knowledge that we gain through neuroscience. How can we explain that to the broader audience, so to speak? Yes. And I think that was one of the things that was really, scientific journalism and all that. I think there's a lot of misunderstandings and intentional or not, simplifications that need to be amended. So I was interested in I started blogging and things like that. So as part of my studies in aging, but also into emotions and decision making, I got an invite to the Copenhagen Business School to start a multidisciplinary group that was between the Danish Tech University, the Copenhagen Business School, and the University Hospital to establish a lab, basically, focusing on decision making and decision neuroscience. So that went on to become the Center for Decision Neuroscience. And I must admit that I still wanted to try become even more pragmatic and even more applied. So I started my own company, which is Neurons Inc. And in 2013, and in 2015, halfway through that, I decided to quit my job at my tenure position and just focus 100% on Neurons. And I haven't really looked back ever since. And Neurons is a kind of a applied neuroscience / consumer neuroscience company. And one of the things that we can mention here today is also that we're kind of transferring also all of those data we had gathered is something that we are now trying to mine using machine learning to see if we can create better predictive models, for example, for different types of behaviors. So that's kind of the short of the long story.
Nice. So do you think it was worth the risk of transitioning out of a relatively safe academic environment and running your own business?
Yeah, I think the thing was that as a multidisciplinary researcher, combining economics, psychology, and neuroscience, it didn't really feel safe, to be honest. I think that there's no real kind of
department. You were too far ahead of the curve.
Yeah, it was like, no, you don't really belong anywhere, right?
Yes.
And I think that's the problem. And academic institutions, they live and thrive on, compartmentalizing the research. So, if you really want to stay at a department, you should publish in those journals. That's kind of the lingua franca and the currency for those. And I think that even though my group was really kind of overperforming in terms of, getting funding, publishing in the journals that they wanted, creating curricula, and basically building everything they wanted, it still felt like being the black sheep. And I think that was what I grew tired of. And once the company took off, really got some traction, it was a very easy choice, to be honest. And what I had, what I have decided on since the beginning is to have an open book policy with the company. So instead of having black boxes and we have these IP protection politics, we decided to have either defensive publications or just publish things ourselves, in peer-reviewed scientific journals, and then use that and rather be the best at doing the job instead of trying to compete on having the best secret algorithm. So I think that was kind of the approach we took, and that's why we have succeeded in having a very transparent model that a lot of clients actually like to work with.
Fantastic. So tell us a little bit about neurons. I know you serve a global customer base. Tell us a little bit about your typical customers. What services do you offer, and how do you operationalize those services?
Yeah, we started very much in the U.S. and we've been in the U.S. Most of our work has been in the U.S. I would say 70 to 80% of our work has been in the U.S. A lot for the CPG, the retail industry, the innovation industry. So there's a lot of different types of companies, and we were very lucky in the beginning to strike home with a lot of those companies. And it kind of snowballed from there. We had the kind of the problem luxury. We didn't really have kind of lead generators. We didn't need to go out sell to people because people came to us all the time. So we had a hard time just keeping track with the inbound, so to speak.
So that was to have.
It's the best problem to have, definitely, and we can kind of pick and choose. And people, if they didn't want to pay, the cost that we have for our projects, then we would just turn and take another project. And and still we knew that people would come back if they really wanted it, right? So, and we started by doing neuromarketing studies, consumer neuroscience studies, but a lot of the studies, since we got involved in innovation. With Lowe's, for example, the Lowe's Innovation Labs, but also with companies like Google and Microsoft and some other companies as well, to try out anything from concept testing to prototype testing and the whole kind of funnel there to understand consumer adoption and kind of the friction and flow of consumer adoption.
And would you consider that usability testing, or is it more neuroergonomics? Not to put a label on it, but I know that the type of work that you do covers a broad spectrum of applications. It's not just the typical neuromarketing. We're going to have you watch a movie trailer and see how your brain responds. So maybe speak to that a little bit more, because I think some of the work that you've done is very exciting and cutting edge.
Yeah, and I think that we very early on recognized that there were so many people doing ad testing and copy testing, and of course that's something we do as well, but it wasn't our priority. We wanted to understand the journey, other points of the consumer journey, so to speak, right? So that would be anything from understanding a completely new product, even at the concept level. So we pre-tested, for example, for IKEA. This is something we described in a Harvard Business Review journal. We pre-tested. They wanted to go to the market to offer renewable energy. IKEA wanted to offer renewable energy to different markets. So we tested that in 2 different markets in Europe to see how people just understood what level of cognitive demand that it gave, what kind of emotional resonance it gave for people, just to give a kind of feedback on, do people actually understand the concept? Does it kind of break anything for their relationship with IKEA, for example? Does it halo over in a good or a bad way to the IKEA brand? So that was something we did. Then with Lowe's and also with Google's and a lot of other companies, we have tried different types of prototype testing. So early alpha stage, beta stage, and things like that. Do people actually understand the thing they get in their hands? And we tested augmented and virtual reality, since 2012, 13 even. So we have kind of a good traction where we have beta tested Google Tango, the HoloLens, Oculus, all these kind of platforms we have tested. So we have a kind of a very broad and good benchmarks to understand what makes or breaks consumer adoption into new technologies, not even within VR and AR, but also 3D printing, any other new technology.
Application. Yeah, interesting. So on the renewable energy, that's a very interesting one, because I think cross-culturally, certainly where you are in Denmark, there's the green environment. It's the greenest city in the world. There's an embrace of green technology, renewable technology. It's part of the culture. Whereas here, unfortunately, we have a little bit more difficult time wrapping our head around, how do we approach this and still protect, individuality and, our choices. Did you do different countries where you evaluated that concept?
Yeah, so IKEA wanted to test two different markets, in terms of level of maturity and for this. So we tested in Poland, which is, Poland is not as used to talk about renewable energy. So that was one thing. And then we tested in, I can't remember if it was Holland or the UK, but these are equal when it comes to
Mhm,
maturity for
mhm.
this. So, and we definitely saw differences in what kind of pricing model, what level of understanding, the level of appeal that those different countries on average responded to. So that was a very interesting study to show that, even when we used EEG equipment, when people looked at, first of all, what did people pay attention to? Did they
Right.
read different segments? That was one thing. How much did they actually pay attention to creative elements, for example, and how did that influence their choice? And the second was also, how do people respond? Is it information overload for people to actually read about this and think about IKEA at the same time, because there might be a mismatch in people's head there. So, and I was in Poland, there definitely was some struggles going on there, some cognitive challenges, definitely.
Mhm.
So, while in Western Europe, European countries, then we definitely saw that it was much more like a smooth transition. It was obvious for people that sure they would definitely go with that idea.
Yeah.
And what that brings is then that IKEA learned that they need to communicate differently to different
Yes.
countries. And
Yeah.
as a company, that's tough because it means that you need to understand every single market.
Mhm.
So it means that you can't just have one solution and just blast that out to the global community. You definitely need to understand where the market is, and then you need to learn how to communicate to that. So
Right.
that was kind of one of the learning points.
So very much a personalized messaging, like personalized medicine. We all
Yeah,
have somewhat different perspectives that you need to learn how to tap into.
yeah,
Um,
definitely.
what are the hot topics for you right now? I mean, obviously vaccines. Are you doing any work in that area to assess people's responsivity or acceptance of?
You can say we're not really testing the reception per se, but what we are currently doing is that we're studying different types of consumer behaviors, and we are including some of the level of influence that this pandemic has had on people. So, to what extent have people actually been affected
Yes.
by, either
Yeah.
being ill or financially affected by it? And the second is, to what extent are they concerned about the current pandemic or the financial situation that comes with it? So, and then we use that as regressors in our analysis to see, does that drive any changes in the market in how people respond to different types of communication, different types of products, and so forth.
Hmm.
So one that we currently are exploring is the level of travel. So what do people feel about traveling these days? Because it's still possible to travel certain places, but of course a lot of people feel extremely unsafe, and it really depends on where in the world we are and which regions you would travel to. And then on top of that, there might be a factor playing at play here that things like how do you feel about the current pandemic might also affect the way that people respond to it as well. So there might be individual, but also cultural differences and destination differences or effects.
Right. And I know you've done some work and published some work on travel destinations and how people select travel destinations and um, predict it, or using neuroscience-based predictors to understand those decisions. And I
Yeah.
guess there's a whole cascade of effects with COVID on those types of decisions.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that there's a realization in a lot of different, traditional consumer behavior response or even management disciplines, that there's a realization that for a long time, psychology has influenced the way that economics have been thinking about consumer decisions and people's decisions. Psychology has moved on for a long time to include neuroscience. So, why shouldn't these new multidisciplinary areas also have an added value? So there's a realization, and we see that this kind of there's a movement within things like tourism research, travel research, now also picking up on this.
And how about, you mentioned briefly your work with VR, AR, and testing different devices, and how that has changed the way industry and many companies do training. Do you work in that area, training, education, simulation? Can you
Yeah, we
talk a
did.
little bit about that?
We do that to some extent. It hasn't been our primary area, but we have run some large scale studies. So the types of study we do in those respects is that we build it as a kind of multiple stepwise process. The first step is actually to talk to the client in terms of and do desk research for them to see what is the current standard in the industry. So imagine that you have a client that wants to understand, how does learning happen in my organization, or how can I make sure that my customers are learning the tools that I want them to use? Or what is the, how can I improve the adoption or the habituation of my it's change management, basically, right? So we come up with a combination of the first step being the desk research of current research in their main area and the industry, the psychology of change management and learning and memory, and then also the neuroscience part of that. And based on that, we come up with a set of recommendations for, first of all, the steps that they could take. We typically identify some errors and some places they can improve already at that point. But then we also come up with a 2, 3, or 4 different studies that we recommend based on what we have for them. And then we run those studies, and then we summarize everything at the end and come up with a larger conclusion and set of recommendations based on those studies. And that takes like 1.5 years for a kind of full study to be completed. So we do that sometimes. And they have also always been very successful, because the first thing that the client and the company learns is a new set of tools and a new set of concepts, or even better definitions or new definitions of existing concepts. So it means that they deepen their understanding of what's going on with their clients or their customers. And they also understand now that they have some tools that they can adjust on, and they also have some tools that they can use for measuring and tapping into these different processes. So there's a lot of learning going on, and any company that wants to do this, they have to realize that there's a lot of learning, and they have to set aside.
Yes, especially if you're doing something with consumers at the consumer level. Yeah.
Definitely.
And I know you mentioned Lowe's briefly, but we had the pleasure of collaborating with you on a project where we gauged interaction with the Lowe's customer service robot. Have you done any, I mean, you can talk about that, but also, is there any other work that you've been involved in with robotics or social robots, communicating with humans, that sort of work?
Sure. So the work that we did, I think that was really cool. It was a lot of fun because it was, on the one side, Lowe's were rolling out this Oshbot, now called Lowbot, that in their stores, which would help client or customer interaction, right? So to help them find their way in the store. The question is always, when you have something that is a robot-ish, or just a robot, or some kind of interaction that is non-human, the question is, do people freak out, right? And then there's this idea that and there's this idea of the uncanny valley, right? That when something is, it doesn't even need to be a robot that looks like a human, or some video game where something looks like a human, but it's not very close enough to be a human, and people freak out. It can even be just voices, right? When you use a voice like Siri or the Google call, for example, or in this case, the Lowbot. And the question was, one of the things that we wanted to test, of course, was to what extent are people responding positively or negatively to this robot, depending on what the robot is saying. And I think that one of the things that we found out was that the robot shouldn't throw the occasional joke. That kind of freaked people out. And it really helped if you had the robot being a little bit kind of clunky and driving into stuff a little bit, to be
very more robot-like than human-like was actually preferred in that environment. Yeah.
So I think that was very. I was very positively surprised to see that we can pick up on those responses in people, even in a really almost like a typical robot, right? It's kind of this pillar running on wheels, and it just has a voice or just a touch screen. Even there, we can see that people freak out, right? So I think that was really cool to see that it was actually possible to.
And even the fact that it ran into things occasionally made it actually more appealing than if it was perfect. Although at one point I recall It was able to detect what color shirt you had on by using access to the internet. So it saw a red shirt and I go, oh, I like your red shirt. That was a little bit too close to home.
That was way over top. Yeah, that was way, people freaked
Yeah.
out.
But that was a fun study, and it kind of opened my eyes to the fact that Lowe's really is a very innovative company in exploring, whether it's the VR approach to home design or having one of the first customer service robots and try in their store.
Yeah. And
What?
I think one thing I think that's
Oh,
really interesting to understand as well is that you don't need to think about this only to be about robots, right? Because as soon as you think about the Siri or any chatbot or anything like that, there will be this element that you need to understand. A lot of companies are now using automated, natural language processing to have on website, on their apps and things like that. They have, interaction points, so to speak, for their clients and customers. And if that doesn't work, people are going to freak out, and that's going to be a negative experience to people, while they might not be able to pinpoint exactly what's going on. So understanding that uncanny response that people might have is critical, and it seems that a lot of more and more companies are actually employing this without really testing. So that's a dark horse, to be honest.
that's great. Yeah, I think that's something we can measure with EEG,
Yep.
combination of EEG and mobile eye tracking. What other technologies or advancements have you been involved with assessing different AI platforms and understanding how those are being, increasingly applied and people's responses to those?
Yeah, we have tested we haven't really tested anything comparable to the Lobot. We have tested more like how people respond to chatbots, to interaction points, and different types of touch points where there might be an avatar, but nothing close to the Lobot, to be honest. And that was, it's probably also overkill to expect that we could build
That was science fiction, cutting edge.
Exactly.
So what about your work, which actually I think more grounded in your psychology background, but when you're looking at the effects of multitasking, I think about this constantly now when I'm on a Zoom call and there's 27 boxes with people talking, there's a chat going on. People are private chatting with me and I'm completely overwhelmed. So tell us a little bit about now, for younger people, maybe their brains are actually organized and structured somewhat differently because they're used to having three things in their hand and, doing things simultaneously. For slightly older folks, it's a little more daunting, but I think you've done some really interesting work in this area, if you could share with us.
Sure. I think that what we have seen when it comes to chats typically, and also the combination of Zoom calls in adjacent to these kind of multitasking, is that, first of all, I think that it definitely leads to cognitive overload. There's no doubt about it. Because the more information you have to process in one time, is just you are loading your working memory, and there's only a high limit, a certain limit to what you can process. There might be individual differences, but they're not that big, right? So, and I think that it's more like a cultural difference that the younger generation are more accepting towards people not, that they can, you can see when a person is chatting, right? You can definitely see that, right?
Yeah.
So I think that our generation is probably less inclined to be acceptable towards that, but I think the younger generation are more acceptable towards that. And I think that's where all the stigma is. I think that's our challenge, is just to say, okay, it's the new normal to some extent, that we have to just, accept that that's what's going on. Or the other way around is that we can educate the younger generation to say, hey, stay focused. We're here. Let's not, multitask too much. But there's definitely this component of that we see that when that happens, and people do, even the younger generation, when they're doing multitasking, there's an increase in cognitive load that becomes way too high for people to actually hold all that information activated in one time. So what happens is that you drop out in and out of both conversations, so to speak. So you lose information both ways. So, and it's just, I think that there was a very kind of powerful study in, I think it was 2005, 6 or 7, something like that, from Stanford, that showed that people who were using media multitasking at that point, so this is kind of a bit before social media, but at the time where people were just zapping between devices. And they recruited people who did a lot of zapping between different devices, and also people who did that to a lesser degree. And then they gave them formal tests of attention, concentration, learning, and memory, kind of psychological test. And they found that those people who multitasked more were actually performing worse. They were worse at task switching. They were worse at concentrating. They were less inclined to remember information and learn that information. So it means that those at that time who were more inclined to do media multitasking were actually poorer at doing the task. So they were more distractible, so to speak. And I think that still holds up with with these devices, these distraction devices, right? So I think that there's a lot to learn for the young generation. I think that the problem we're doing is that we're just taking it for granted that they are digital, IT savvy, and they can just do it, right? They can't do it, and that's just a simple truth. There's no way around it. And the other thing we did was we also did a study for Facebook where we compared how conversations worked in real life as opposed to virtual reality, and also compared to some extent this to chat, video chats as well. And the interesting thing was that, first of all, we typically see that when people are on Zoom calls, basically, we see that people are less emotionally engaged on average than if they are in person. That might be due to fewer social cues. There was just a lot of things going on. But we found that even a relatively primitive version of a social chat function in Oculus was much more engaging. So when we measured the arousal level in people, they were much more engaged when they were in this environment as opposed to chat, video chat, or a Zoom call like. But it was comparable to in person, but not to the extent, and not fully to the same extent, but it was in between, so to speak. And the second we found was that people who were more naturally introverted were actually more engaged in the virtual environment than in person-to-person talk, and the opposite for extroverts. So there's definitely some components here that these kind of digital media might be good for some, but it might be more challenging to others as well.
Yeah, very interesting work.
Yeah, and this was all done with EEG as well. And I think that part of the challenge here is also, one of the challenges we haven't really mentioned this explicitly here today, but I think it's the way that it's possible to now move out of the lab is really dramatically changing the types of studies you can do. Now, of course, it does come with the price, right? Because you do lose data, and you do need to think about the way that you construct your paradigms and your tests to minimize signal drops, so to speak.
Right.
But one of the things that we saw and learned very early on with using head devices or head-mounted devices such as the Oculus was that as soon as people started moving their head too much, EEG goes haywire. You just lose a lot of signal. It's too much motor noise, right? So we had to kind of think our way around that a little bit. So, but still, this is light years ahead of doing fMRI studies.
Right, and hopefully we'll keep evolving in that regard. Is there anything?
I don't think it will regress, hopefully.
Yeah. Is there anything that we could do? I know we've been your EEG provider for many years, and we certainly appreciate that partnership and had an opportunity to work on some of these exciting studies with you. Is there anything that we could do better to provide better support for you? I think at one point, I don't know if this is still true, but I think at one point you were doing close to 1,000 human subject studies a year, or maybe more.
Yeah. If it wasn't, we were just, 2019, we actually took a hit on the revenue last year to actually improve our protocols. And we went from, we improved our project profits and everything last year. So we were just ready to go for 2020. So 2020 was going to be the year for us, and let's see what happens.
Yeah, yes, I know.
But,
all in the same boat.
yeah. No, but we have, we've just opened also a lab in Brazil. In these
congratulations.
days, we have, as you know, we also have open in Dubai. So there's through the Zayed University, so they are partners, and we're doing studies for them, and they have equipment as well. So the whole idea is that we're kind of spreading out the grid, if you like, for data collection. And also we just launched the lab in the US, so in Dallas. So that means that the whole idea here is that we're setting ourselves up for doing even more in-person studies. And I should say, of course, that we're doing more. We're opening some online solutions. We're opening for the NeuroVision, the SaaS solution as well.
Sure.
But for the the NeuroLab, the whole idea is still to ramp up that business as well, and that's what we're preparing for. So when things get back more to normal, the idea is that we can grab that and capture that along the way. And of course, what we see in the market that we are in is that also Nielsen are actually one of our biggest competitors, have been ramping down on their offerings of neuroscience solutions. So that means that for us, it's an opportunity to to scale at the same time. So
great, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
And in the next 5 years or so, do you have kind of a big vision for other labs that you might set up, other areas of the world, other specific projects that you're targeting?
Yeah, we are definitely adding. So I'm not sure if you know, but this is just about to be released as a press release, but we have taken on our first round of investors.
Ooh, congrats.
Yeah, so we have the Danish Growth Foundation. So that's a kind of a big thing here in Denmark, have come in as investors, and together with a smaller private equity foundation that is called Finance Zealand. But they have come in and they're now on the board, and this is going to be announced. And the whole thing is that that will, we're going to focus on. Now the crisis came, and the whole idea was that for us to do 2020 was going to be kind of a neural lab year. So we're going to ramp up our business in the US and everything. And then for 2021, the idea was to build online capabilities as well for certain types of online panel testing for implicit test. And then also our AI tool, the NeuroVision tool, which kind of uses has used kind of a large database. I think it's 13,000 people of eye tracking, and we're still adding data to that to train machine learning models to predict attention, right? Yeah. So that is what the investors have come in on, is both these kind of scalable products, but also to ramp up the lab solutions. So if you think 3 to 5 years ahead from now, the plan is then to have a scalable model for the AI and the SaaS solutions and on your online tools, and then also to ramp up the modules for the NeuroLab. And I think it's worth mentioning that what we are building into this is that we're not just treating them as separate products, but we're treating, for example, the NeuroLab as a way to feed in new data into the algorithms, the machine learning algorithms. Yes. So that's the whole plan. So we're still we're still ramping up the scale for us to be able to train and gather data, because machine learning, they're data hungry beasts, right?
But it's hungry for data. It's a data consumer. So the more data that you can accumulate, the better the models will become. Are there any specific algorithms or anything that you're working on building, or just refining some of the algorithms that you already have?
Oh, we started from scratch. So we basically started from scratch in using and building actually even the machines themselves to say.
That's great.
First, high quality eye tracking data, going through every single kind of data point to make sure that we have high quality data on the eye tracking, and then also know exactly what we were looking for. And then training the algorithm for the first 5 seconds of exposure to, standardized analysis.
Right. That's great.
And then also for different verticals as well. So that was social media, it was advertising, it was retail, it was web pages, and a lot of different things. And we still add both verticals, but also to those piles as well. And then we have tried, I think we tried something like 32 different models and a lot of different iterations of those models. And they were just running for weeks and weeks and weeks. And all of a sudden we saw that we were onto something, and we could see that the model prediction went over 90% accuracy, which is fantastic. Way beyond what I had imagined. And we do 3 types of comparison. The first comparison we do is pixel by pixel. So basically, you show the same heat map, the eye tracking heat map, and the NeuroVision prediction heat map, and we can do a pixel by pixel comparison, so to speak. So that's like a regression analysis or correlation analysis. Then the second level is areas of interest analysis. We compare, we aggregate within an AOI, and then we compare the values there. And the third level is actually the one thing I came up with that I thought that was interesting, was to have people blinded to what type of heat map they were looking at, whether they're looking at an eye tracking heat map or a neurovision heat map, and ask them 4 or 5 different questions, and would they come to the same conclusions given the heat map? And we find for all of those that the accuracy is over 9%. So that means that people do get to the same conclusions,
Yes.
looking at, regardless of which
Yes,
heat map.
that's great. That's always good to confirm the
Yeah.
ground truth. All right, well, the time has flown by. As always, it's a great pleasure to talk with you. It's been a great collaborative effort, and I appreciate you and your team, and we hope to work together for a long time into the future.
I couldn't agree more. Absolutely, and thanks for having me. This is great.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Take care.
Okay.
Stay safe and healthy.
You too.